Mic check.
Mic check.
It's October 2nd, 2011. This is 508, a show about Worcester, and I think since we've done mic check, this is officially Occupy Worcester.
I think it's just us, though.
Here today at Cook's Pond. Today, my name is Michael Benedetti.
Brendan
This
Melican.
is Brendan Melican with a cup of coffee there.
Sorry I didn't bring you on for you.
I have no coffee today. I'm doing great this morning. Today on 508, or as we now call it, Occupy Worcester, we're going to talk about Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Boston. We're potentially going to talk about city councils, maybe not. Are we going to have Marty Lamb on the show? No, because he still hasn't returned my calls. Although he said he would. We're going to talk about transit hub stuff. We're going to talk about the reopening of the FYC. We're going to talk about District 4 turnout in the preliminary election. We're going to talk about ebooks at the library. We're going to talk about the Downing Street closure. We're going to talk about Great Brook Valley. We're maybe going to talk about the Roku. I don't know. How are you doing, Brendan?
Great.
Which of these topics are exciting to you to start off with?
Yeah, I'd like to start with Marty Lamb. I think Marty should recognize that we have, if you look back on the preliminary election in Worcester that we just had a couple weeks ago, and then you look at the guests that we had on the show that were non-incumbents to come and speak to us,
they win.
You will find that the overwhelming majority of people that we had on the show are still in the election.
Mm-hmm.
And Marty should take note of that. I mean, if he actually wants to stand a chance at all, and maybe even be taken seriously for once in his life,
I think the Barfer's given up on politics. I think this is what this represents, him not being on our show.
He's just not interested in politics anymore.
And I don't blame him.
He's going back into the novelty gift market.
That's right. Marty Lamb, of course, our Republican candidate in the last U.S. Congress race, known mainly for his association with, again, promotional barf bags. I am not kidding. Would you rather talk about Occupy Boston first, or would you rather talk about...
We should talk about the election a bit, because there really isn't much to talk about there.
All right. With Occupy Boston, with the election.
With the election.
Sure. So we had a preliminary election recently because we had more than twice as many of the candidates as you would need to hold an election in November. So they have a preliminary to kind of winnow them down. We had a couple of the at-large city council candidates who were winnowed out of the process, and a few of the district candidates. Kevin Kassan actually sent me something. He's going to send me more novelty trivia about the election, running the statistics. In District 4 of the city, for example, 36 people under 30 voted in the preliminary election.
These are not necessarily happy statistics or things that you
these are just he found this to be sort of discouraging.
Yeah.
There were only 619 people voting out of District 4. There were only 8,000 people total. 40% of them actually were from districts 2, 4, and 5. Represent. Basically, so that means basically 60% of the people voting in the election were people who were from the two districts where there was actually a preliminary race on the district level.
Right.
Of the 5 districts, 60% of the people voting were from that. So, and District 4 had slightly less turnout than you would have expected, even in those dire circumstances. 6%, yeah. So 6% of the voters in District 4 were under 30. 26% were over 70 by Kevin's statistic, which is numbers that we know, which is that people who are old are highly motivated voters. People who are young do not vote, no matter what people's dreams as a young politician are.
Yeah, and I think that what's been interesting in the last couple of weeks is the number of folks, pundits and whatnot, trying to read everything that they can into those numbers. And the reality is, your numbers that you're looking at are so statistically insignificant when you look at the big picture. I think the only thing that you could take away from this is that, generally speaking, Worcester residents just don't care about their local politicians anymore. Mm-hmm. And as grim and cynical as that may sound, that's something that Worcester politicians might want to think about taking note of, that you have actually become irrelevant. More people are watching college football, just about any television program that you can imagine, including us on Channel 13, than actually care about what you do every Tuesday. And, the only thing that you could do to explain that is that you haven't done anything memeaningful in the last 20 years.
I think that there are things that go on a Tuesday that are worth paying attention to.
They are worth paying attention to, but the outcomes are so predictable and so heavily based in nonsense that I think people have really just kind of given up on this being an experiment that's worth them partaking in.
So the idea would be that what the city is up to is definitely worth paying attention to. The city councilor's role in it is marginal, unfortunately.
Right, and I think if you were to pay attention to anything, it would probably just be the actions of the city manager, because even though the charter seems to indicate that the role of the city council is to dictate the agenda of the city manager, it seems as though the city manager is doing a fine job just on his own. Whether you agree with him or not,
We should start referring to that as a controversial provision of the city charter, because the city council at least is not excited about the idea that they would be in charge of.
They're not excited
the
about
city.
that role at all. Yeah, and it's what's crazy though. So if you adding to Kevin's statistics there, I think it cost us $165,000 roughly to host this election.
$20 a voter.
Roughly $20 per voter. If you get into District 4, off the top of my head, I'm not going to do the math here, but break down the number of voters who showed up in District 4 and adjust for, what it costs just them to show up and vote.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're only looking at the district, it's an insane amount of money per person that was spent just to go out and cast a vote. The one thing that drives me crazy, and more so now, is why are we even having, a preliminary election? All we did was shave 2 people off.
Right.
If you've got so few people showing up to begin with, that their opinions don't necessarily matter because it's statistically irrelevant. Shaving 2 people off, it's almost doing the overall field a disservice, right? In November, you could find that those 2 people may very well have been the best candidates there,
right?
And 8% of the electorate decided, let's get rid of them. The other thing is, why are we having off-season elections to begin with?
You mean rather than synchronizing our city elections
with the state and federal calendar,
yeah.
which happens next year, right? Next year being a presidential year, you're going to have more people showing up to vote in all likelihood.
There's nothing going on behind you.
It sounds like there is. I think I'm just losing my mind.
You're just listening to the falls. It's a bird.
It's a heron.
Potentially a chipmunk. Okay.
You're in all likelihood, you're going to have a large turnout for the presidential election in 2012.
Sure.
Wouldn't it make more sense to expose Worcester voters who are going to come out in droves for that election to a handful of names that they may not actually recognize because they stopped paying attention to Worcester politics years ago? It would just seem to make a little bit more sense. And I'm not 100% sure about how this works, but I believe that to some degree their costs are offset because the state election calendar versus just a local election calendar.
So the idea is that if we're going to have elections that people are not excited about, at least we could have cheaper ones.
At least we could have cheaper ones, and in theory make them more meaningful because they're being wrapped into a larger process.
Let me say something. Now, I have credibility in this because the last 2 election cycles, I have gone on this show to say I didn't vote and I didn't think you should vote. You should vote in this election. I'm just telling you right now, you're making a huge mistake if you think that this election doesn't matter. The city council is not as powerful as they could be, but you know what? For the 10 minutes that it takes you to vote, there's so few people voting. You have a lot of impact. Like, you and the people on your street could really, in some cases, swing these elections.
This goes back to when we first started doing the show. We used to, and it isn't so much the case anymore. This is a big city. We used to joke about how if you and 12 of your buddies showed up at the city council meeting, you could potentially change the course of local government. With that low of a turnout, it's not a joke anymore.
Assuming your buddies weren't city councilors.
Assuming your buddies weren't
just a little.
Well, no, you could probably talk some of them into voting against their own best interests as well. It's become such a common theme for them to be voting against the general public's best interests that you might actually be able to talk them into voting themselves out of office now. But point being, you don't need that many people to start actually influencing local government now. So you're absolutely right, but I don't think it's going to change anything.
It doesn't. Well, that's all right. Anyway, I have a lot of hope here. Let's talk about Occupy Boston. So we started the show off with Mike Check.
Mike Check.
Which is this. I wish some of our guests who were supposed to be here to talk about Occupy Boston were also here. Brendan was at Occupy Boston, though.
I stopped on Monday night, just for a little while. I wasn't really partaking in the whole thing. It was just passing through. But
what was your impression?
Incredibly impressive.
Wait, Monday night or?
A Friday night.
Friday night, yeah.
I work in downtown Boston. Stopped through on Friday evening. The most impressive thing was seeing the Boston skyline covered with helicopters, not from news services, but law enforcement, both local, state, and federal. That was pretty. You don't often see that hovering over the city, downtown area of Boston. But then getting into Dewey Square Park and just seeing the swarm of people that were there. I think the police department estimated just over 2,000 people, 3,000 from their march down from the Common, which took place earlier in the day, and then 2,000 into the night, mostly people camping and whatnot, coming and going. It was pretty inspiring, and all of this in the shadow of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston.
It's kind of an awesome place to do it.
Kind of an incredible place to do it, yeah. And in concert with what's taking place in Manhattan, which the numbers are swelling rapidly. Actually, Friday it seemed to be their sort of watershed moment where the majority of union support started pouring in, and numbers rose from roughly 2,000 people to 5,000 people. Now it seems close to approaching the 10,000 person mark through Liberty Square, and in Manhattan, and then now spreading elsewhere. I mean, in theory, the Brooklyn Bridge has now been occupied. New York City police headquarters have been occupied. What's interesting with that is, the New York Police Department seems to be employing kettling, as a term typically only here coming out of our friends on the other side of the pond, but seem to actually be using that mentality now, where you've got 700 people who are in theory trapped on the Brooklyn Bridge right now, just being blocked off on both sides. The same goes for police headquarters. People are just kind of penned off in numbers. Not actually, they're making arrests, but they're not actually putting handcuffs on people because the numbers are so large. They're actually just penning them into areas.
Right.
Yeah, interesting stuff.
What is your this is obviously coming out. This Occupy Boston is obviously coming out of this Occupy Wall Street that's been going on for a couple of weeks now.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I think it's pretty exciting, both because it's been going on for so many weeks now. It's finally getting mainstream media attention, including this show, as mainstream as it gets. Don't complain the MSM is not covering your protest, because it's right here. It's happening right here.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's pretty interesting that it's this combination. My impression is this weird fusion of anarchists, anonymous, union members, whatever, and all kinds of other folks now filtering into
I was reading
this.
stories yesterday about large groups of recently retired military personnel showing up in their dress uniforms and whatnot to hold lines between protesters and police. And it isn't, the more you read, the more you see disgruntled middle class folks, typically a little bit older, my own demographic, saying, this is stupid hippies just getting in my way from going to work. It's really not that. It is actually a collection. When you hear the Tea Party talk about it being, them being just a collection of regular people,
Yeah.
it's a collection of regular people. I mean, when I was down there Friday night, it was people in suits, in sport coats, as well as people who looked like they could use a bath, but all kind of on the same page, discussing their own personal views on politics. And what was kind of great is you keep hearing people say, well, what are their demands? What are their goals? And the group itself is just being made up of regular people, seems to be willing to acknowledge that we don't necessarily have clearly defined goals, but that's kind of the point, because human beings actually need to get together and discuss their problems before you're able to identify potential solutions. And that seems to be the organic process that's taking place.
That's part of the thing. I would think that's at least definitely part of the anarchist influence on something like this too, where it's people saying we're excited to organize a protest. We shy away from trying to do too much top-down.
Right, which
agenda setting
it makes sense to see why, in a way, it makes sense to see why the average American is confused by that, because it's been so long since we've actually had regular people directly partaking in any sort of decision making. We vote, 8% of us, and then we let those people do their thing for 2 years, and we don't really think about it again until another 2 years comes by. The only real demands, so to speak, seem to be trying to engage existing lawmakers into dealing with them directly, to start discussing, or at least acknowledging, that we seem to be in a world in turmoil from an economic perspective, and something needs to give on that front relatively quickly.
And that maybe banks are too... I would say, obviously, the idea that banks are too politically powerful is a big part of it. This is there's many agendas here, but that's one that seems like very much of a common thread.
That seems to be a cornerstone, and I don't think there's many people on the planet who should be able to come up with a good argument with that.
Yeah.
If you are going to try and argue that, you're probably going to lose on some front, and not in a hey, you guys are a bunch of dirty commies sort of way.
Yeah.
It's we've come to a point where, historically speaking, right, if you look at any sort of accumulation of wealth and disparity in that accumulation of wealth, where we are now is almost immediately always followed by some sort of really, really bloody revolution.
Yeah.
And you should have learned that in 4th and 5th grade. This isn't something that people are just being crazy and socialists, right? There's actually a problem out there with when it comes to wealth accumulation.
One of the things that's come out of this, I should say two things that have come out of this that are interesting to me. One of them is the People's Microphone, which is an innovation that, I think this is an innovation that came out of these protests at Wall Street, where you needed a loudspeaker to address hundreds of thousands of people. You weren't allowed to have a loudspeaker. So you would stand up and you would say, mic check.
Mic check.
And then everything you would say, hello, and everybody would say hello, and in some ways sort of creepy and in some ways sort of cool, especially for people who are not sort of anti-authoritarian, to all be saying the same thing over and over, especially people they may disagree with. Kind of an interesting not call and response, but repeating, having the crowd repeat, the people who can hear the speaker repeat what the speaker has just said to the rest of the crowd. The other interesting thing is framing this as the 99%.
Right.
This idea that 1% of Americans control
50% of the
half of the wealth of the country, which is, and again, just the critique of this idea seems like a common a common part of this. The belief that like even like I would say that like it's not surprising that like some minority of people control the majority of the wealth. People just talk about an 80-20 rule, for example, for various reasons. Number one, a lot of people are not interested. Really, wealth accumulation is not a priority for a lot of people, either because of personal preference or they're Christian or some other reason. And second of all, like the skill to do wealth accumulation is not evenly distributed either. So of that percent that want to accumulate wealth, some are going to be better than others. Sure, if 20% of the people control, if 80% of the people, if it's you have some sort of 80-20 rule thing, that's like seems like again like socially destabilizing, but sort of reasonable.
Sure.
This like 1%, 50% thing seems a little bit on the extreme.
It can't sustain itself, and it's again because I oftentimes wonder what people think of when they think of like money, right? But I mean, it's not money trees, right? That you can just grow in your backyard and then someday you'll be wealthy too. I mean, there's X amount of cash out there or value out in the world, and when people start hoarding that, and like you said, most people don't think of hoarding money. Most Americans, they're good at hoarding bottle caps and kittens. They don't really hoard cash. But we do have this one small segment of the population that has successfully managed to do that, essentially since the end of World War II. And that can't sustain itself. And again, I'm not saying that. For those of you who think like stupid communist kid, go back to when we first started doing this show, probably like 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was always the annoying guy who stood here and made crazy, like market-based arguments for everything.
This is basically still a libertarian show.
Yeah, I mean, and we're talking about something that has historical precedent, right? You remember like the old Bastille, right? I mean, the Bolsheviks. This all has to do with people saying, "Hey, they got more stuff than us, but way more stuff," and making a stand on that front, and it doesn't end well. And I think what you have here are a lot of mostly young people, and I'll give that, and oftentimes that turns off, a more stable population in terms of like economic stability.
Right.
But the thing is, that's also a young demographic that's looking at 25% unemployment rates right now. Like, and they stand to go, we go another 2 or 3 years, you're going to have an entire generation that will have known nothing but chronic unemployment in its entire lifetime. And we do know that, as a matter of fact, that that unemployment, people who are unemployed become unemployable. So this is chronic unemployment that will all likelihood carry through the rest of their lives, unless something major changes.
Right.
Wars, big wars, like ones with numbers 1 and 2 after them, have started using massive amounts of unemployed young people as a catalyst for those wars. It's not good stuff.
Let's not have a world war in this country, people. That's what we're saying.
And again, it's not really doomsday stuff. This is, you look back at history, and one of the always the threads that goes along with tragedy is that the majority of the population didn't realize that they were wrapped up into something really, really bad, because life is typically okay for the average person. Not terrible, not great.
You're hanging in the woods, you're drinking your coffee, things are being cool, and then suddenly Nazis everywhere.
Suddenly Nazis. And not just at the Worcester Public Library, just a more general sort of like,
like actual Nazis, not play Nazis, not playtime Nazis.
Or just economic collapse, right? I mean, how many times a day does the average person check in to see what's going on between the International Monetary Fund and Greece, right? I mean, the EU is like on the verge of utter collapse right now. That impacts you as an American, right? Because our banking and financial systems are all tied together. That's not something that your government, that your legislators stand any sort of ability to run interference on. That could just happen on its own because of wealth inequality and wealth hoarding. That's something that needs to at least be thought about, right? And again, I think it's interesting that the folks that are at these events, they don't claim to have all the answers, but they hope that by bringing people together from different worldviews, might actually start coming up with some solutions.
There's a lot of alternatives. I'm gonna tweet Occupy Worcester so that it's officially a thing, and there it is. And now
my neighbors are gonna be really upset with you if hundreds and thousands of people start showing up here at the pond.
Whose pond? The Tatnick Brook Watershed Association's pond.
The Noviks are gonna be so angry with you.
Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of things. There's transit. Several people asked me to talk about WRTA stuff. This is the local bus stuff. So they've announced a couple of things. One is that before Thanksgiving, all the buses are going to have like a centralized tracking system in them that will be centrally coordinated, and there'll be some sort of thing you can have on your phone to actually like see where the buses are physically
This is Worcester?
in the city of Worcester by Thanksgiving.
Wow. So I mean, Boston's been doing that for a while, but wouldn't it be more with the small number of riders that we have on the WRTA? Wouldn't it just make more sense to ask the police department to start tracking those individuals with their cell phones? Which
We should just have a phone a friend service. If anybody needs to know where the number 6 bus is, you can just call me, because probably I'm on the number 6 bus.
Yeah,
and
if you're not, it's just sitting at the end of the street.
And I'm happy to handle 2 or 3 calls a day, which is what I would get for the number 6 bus. So, also the transit hub. What's the deal with the transit hub? The answer is that they're going to be having like a groundbreaking for this new bus transit hub at Union Station in the spring, and by sometime in 2013, which is the year after next year, for those of you who don't have a calendar handy, there'll be a new transit hub, so that rather than all the buses eventually stopping around City Hall, they'll stop somewhere, some facility in Union Station.
Can I make a suggestion to the city of Worcester? And I don't expect you or anybody else to agree with this.
I disagree with you. I pre-disagree with you.
No more groundbreakings. I understand why groundbreakings are awesome, because that's when the money starts coming in and everyone as a part of the project gets excited. But as residents and taxpayers, the ones who actually pay for these projects, then we tend to just stare at a big hole in the ground for the next 10, 15 years. Or you guys just talk about it at city council every once in a while, maybe bring it up to remind us that the project's still in play. Instead of focusing on groundbreakings, focus on the ribbon cuttings. I think if your thought was
no ceremony, no groundbreaking ceremony,
no groundbreaking ceremony, just a ribbon cutting when it's open, right? When something is done. That way, your eye stays on the ball, and you're only thinking about getting this finished so you can actually get out there and
It's all about finishing and not starting. The groundbreaking is there's a dude with a backhoe, he starts cutting into the ground, the press say, "Can I ask you a question?" He says, "No."
I mean, watch
I'm
this,
on
Mike.
the clock.
You and I could say, Mike, I announced that on this very land, we're going to build Worcester's first professional football stadium. And there we go. Now, I mean, the rest of the city can sit around for the next 50 years and wait for the football stadium to show up. It's not going to happen. But if you kept your eye on the ribbon cutting, then you knew you could clear your calendar and you could just get on with life, and they're going to let us know when it's time to actually show up and be excited about our new football stadium. And I will get back to you when that's built.
Very good, very good. Okay, the FYC has a grand reopening. They're also going to have a consignment store, or kind of a thing like a high-end thrift store for women's clothing.
Nice.
In the 420 Pleasant Street. Pretty cool. It was good to be at the grand reopening. There were like kids and dogs, which I feel is always a sign of life for any enterprise. E-books at the library. You know that for a long time you've been able to check out like MP3s from the library. Like you can get a weird device which will play back audiobooks for you, or you can even sometimes, I guess, maybe get a weird device or install a weird program on your computer that you could read novels that you download from the library website. The other day I thought, you know what, like we all have these phones that will do it now. Can you do it that way? The answer is yes. It's way easier. It's way more convenient. You want to install the Overdrive Media Console on your Android or iPhone device, and then you do not want to use the library website at all. You want to go through that Overdrive Media Console, which will open up a little web browser behind the scenes for you, but whatever. And it'll basically just say, like, give me your zip code, give me your library card number, and then it will, like, give you a catalog, which is frustrating to search, but less frustrating than the library's catalog to search, and it will, like, put, like, audiobooks and novels on your phone for free.
Headed in the right direction. Well, some would argue that's the right direction. I know there are a lot of paper devotees out there, and paper obviously has its role in the world of books. But
Speaking of which, Ben Franklin had their going out of business, take our books out of this burned down building thing over.
Did you get anything?
I didn't get anything. I went in and I looked at it and I was like, you know what? Like I have books that I bought from Ben Franklin in the past. I would be sad.
Those books didn't all smell like smoke?
No, it's sad. It was sad. It was sad to see all these like damaged, some of them slightly damp books.
Yeah.
In there. We're just moving fast because we're running out of time, and I want to ask you about housing stuff. Downing Street, the closure of Downing Street. Can you hold this for a second?
Sure.
So, you know that as part of this, for those of you who have not been following this, the city, in order to save face on the fact that it really would like to collect taxes from nonprofits but can't, has this thing it's worked out with the colleges called payment in lieu of taxes, where the colleges give the city a small amount of money every year, which is theoretically goes to the library, but is not in any way earmarked, or does not in any way actually, it just goes into the city's budget and just into a big pool of money, and who knows where it goes from there. In exchange for this small amount of money, the city gives these colleges various land breaks and otherwise doesn't negotiate very hard with them on what the colleges want. In the case of Clark University, Clark wanted to close down part of a street adjacent to the university, which I totally love this idea, people at my parish, St. Peter Parish, less exciting because this would like hurt ambulance access to the parish and the neighborhood and whatever. I just want to say, from the parish bulletin, notice from the City of Worcester and Clark University: in order to conduct a traffic impact study on the proposed closure of Downing Street between Woodland and Florence, the city will close off this section from September 12th through October 7th. In fact, it has been closed off. It'll be interesting to see what the results of this study are for traffic disruption and whatevs.
The likelihood not much will change.
We'll see. I don't know.
Your note.
Thank you, sir. Okay, I want to ask you how much we got 5 minutes. Can we talk about housing in 5 minutes? Great Brook Valley, GBV, run by Worcester Housing Authority. Ray Mariano.
Former mayor.
Apparently mostly funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. There was a good article in the TNG. There's so many questions raised by this that this article doesn't answer, but it actually has some good statistics. Ray Mariano is trying to put together a deal which he has to get HUD approval for. I don't know if he's getting any other approval for, which would basically say if you want to live in city-run public housing and you're under 50, you got to be in school or you got to work.
Right.
Or you got to be in some kind of training situation, I guess. I don't really know. I mean, for example, so 82% of these are single parent situations in Worcester housing. I don't know if this means that like there's some sort of cheap child care for these guys, so these parents can work, or how that works.
It's one of those things that I think is just a great idea on the surface, right? I mean, put people to work, give people training, and help them because that was the theme of the whole idea, was not just go out there and get a job, you lazy bum, but like actually helping people get into some sort of workforce training to then seek gainful, meaningful employment. Problem being that, like we mentioned earlier, we have really high unemployment right now, and if you're unemployed, you automatically become unemployable. So the idea of the training idea is great, but I'm not really convinced that there's any jobs out there for people once they have a new skill set.
Training is not necessarily the problem for everybody.
Isn't necessarily the problem for everybody. I mean, there's definitely certain tool sets that could be lacking in certain populations that see chronic homelessness, and we can fix that. And I think Ray's onto something on a high level that makes a hell of a lot of sense. This just might not be the economy to work that experiment through. The other part of this too, though, is which wasn't discussed very much, and I think partly because it confuses a lot of people. There seem to be some strings attached here in terms of, like, say, parents with their kids, where they're going to try and tie truancy rates to your eligibility for being in public housing.
Yes, that your kids have that. If your kids skip a lot of school, they're counted as not being in school, and so you don't get. I don't know. They kick you out of Great Brook Valley, and you have to get some other kind of public housing.
And again, I don't want to read too much into it because on the surface, it doesn't make any sense to me how, even from a legal perspective, you could base a parent's eligibility for housing on a student's. Let me speak from anecdotally, right? I mean, if my parents' housing was based on my attendance in high school, I skipped roughly 2/3 of my senior year, and my parents would have been evicted from a sewer, if anything was based on my truancy. It just seems like a very irresponsible thing to try and put the burden of not necessarily children, but teenagers, people approaching adulthood on their own, put their experiences and their responsibility that put that burden on parents who, like you said, might be single parents actually trying to figure out a way to make ends meet, and now they have this other thing on the side that they need to take care of.
We have like a minute left.
I'm sorry.
No, you don't have to apologize.
It's just there seems to be more problems with this plan than there are potential successes, both legal and never mind just HUD authority, but maybe like Supreme Court sort of
issues going on here.
And I wish Ray well, because I think he is well intentioned on a very high level. Like if you have chronic unemployment, you need to figure out what it is that's keeping people chronically unemployed, and that takes a lot of work, and you got to start somewhere.
80% of the people in Worcester public housing are unemployed.
Which that sounds crazy until you think, well, there's a reason why people are in public housing. It's in all likelihood because there are financial troubles there. Right. One of which is probably not having a job.
Right.
That isn't necessary. It's the wrong demographic to look at if you're going to do a study on unemployment. I mean,
I wish I knew more about public housing because it does seem like the way that this turns out is that if let's say you're a parent and your kid is like skipping school all the time, or you just can't get a job, and like I don't know, maybe you just have to go to job training forever in that case. But like What happens when I don't understand? I would so if you know about housing, public housing, you should email us at pinecoffee@gmail.com and tell me, and we'll have you on the show, and you can explain this to us.
Including former Mayor Mariano. I mean, come on and talk to us about the plan.
Like, does
because
this just basically kick a couple thousand people out of Worcester public housing into some sort of other federally funded housing in the city?
Well, and I think that's one of the other issues too. So you want to put the screws to somebody. We're short on time. You're going to put the screws to somebody to get their act together. But what if they don't get their act together? Then we just Soylent Green them. I mean, what's the end game in terms of
Electrified steel cage match against Mariano to see who survives. One man stays in GBV, one man leaves. Brendan, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks
Mic
for having
check.
me. Mic check. Occupy Worcester, folks.